Thank you, Mr Speaker. I acknowledge the points the previous two speakers made and the Minister in leading the second reading there, and the first half of the member opposite's speech. And I would endorse the comments about the House Select Committee, FEC Select Committee, dealt with this bill, and it was quite early on in the piece that we identified 2 or 3 pertinent points which did occupy a lot of the committee's time. And you'll see those reflected in the commentary, Mr Speaker. I may, if time permits, address some of the matters that the previous speaker brought up in the second half of his speech, but we'll see how we go for time, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, second reading speech, just a quick kind of commentary on what happened at Select Committee and what we did. The bill is relatively unchanged as sent to us, but there have been, in a couple of areas, some quite serious changes, I think, and as the Minister noted, they were essentially, it is a better bill than got sent to committee. Mr Chair, just to summarise, we actually had 15 submissions on this bill after we opened it and it was sent to our Select Committee, and we did enjoy and again acknowledge the advice, assistance of officials around the table from IRD, from drafting and from our independent advisor, Therese Turner, who assists us greatly. And I think all members acknowledge the assistance and the helpful pointers that they do give us as we deal with what seem to be many tax bills. They do seem to go into one after a while, Mr Speaker. And even as I was looking through this one, I started thinking about another bill. So anyway, it's all good tax and it's all good improvement. And Mr Speaker, the Select Committee, though, did hone in on a couple of key points, but what we did when we started to go down a particular road, we actually took ourselves back and go, hey, what was the original intent, the main primary intent of this bill? And it was to address the so-called Phoenix transactions and structures. So as we were wondering about some of the burdens of proof on some of the issues of vendor or supplier of services, etc., and around bank accounts, and I'll touch on those in a minute, the access to joint bank accounts and things, actually the committee did go back to first principles and say, actually, and if you looked at the Minister's first reading speech from memory, it was all about the Phoenix scheme, and essentially they are there has been the ability of two parties having different GST invoice time. One could be cash, one could be invoice-based, one could be 6 monthly or whatever. And essentially in the midst of generally probably a property transaction, i.e. land, one of those companies collapses or has collapsed itself or is encouraged to collapse and liquidate. And at the end of the day, Mr Speaker, one entity is left long in credit of GST, and the entity owing the GST, of course, collapses. At the end of the day, the taxpayer is at a loss. And in these constrained times, in fact, even in the best of times, that is not a fair burden on the rest of the taxpayers, Mr Speaker. So we did actually spend a bit of time, and I acknowledge Sir Roger Douglas, who particularly picked up a couple of points in and around which entity had the burden, and I think the other speakers talked about the nominees, companies who may be involved in land transactions. Yes, we spent a lot of time on learning about the definition of land, but actually, if innocent parties or an innocent party enters a transaction, there comes a time where, if they've asked the right questions, or their nominees have asked the right questions, or got the right paperwork regarding the GST registered or not of the vendor or the entity responsible for organising themselves, if they've gone through the correct hoops, well, we had quite a bit of discussion about that, and we did come to the conclusion that actually let's put a few more parameters around that. And again, I'll acknowledge Sir Roger, who picked that up and made issue of it, and to the point of members can see the changes in here under the supply of goods and the commentary there, and then the supplies of land, Mr Speaker, and of course the various definitions. Another point that occupied our time was a little bit about the student accommodation point, Mr Speaker, but just to cut to the chase, because we actually spent a bit of time defining what student accommodation was. Could it be the hostels up the road? Could it be a boarder at home? Could it be your own son or daughter essentially boarding? So you can just see how complex that can get. And again, we went back to first intent. The intent wasn't to add complexity to the situation. And so again, as reflected in the commentary of the bill, you can see what we considered. And very importantly, if you look at the last paragraph there in the commentary, we have received assurance, it is in writing here from Inland Revenue and Treasury that they are monitoring the practical application of the changes in the definitions to guard against inconsistent or unfair treatment insofar as boarding houses, boarders or
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member, but the time has come for me to leave the chair. This debate is interrupted. I shall resume the chair at 7:30.